Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Meena Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs and the Director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency in the Peter S. Kalikow School of Government, Public Policy, and International Affairs at Hofstra University. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here today for our panel, Promise or Peril? Evaluating the first year of the Biden presidency and the Kalikow School Poll. We have many topics to discuss today, and I am especially delighted that all of the research that has been done for this poll, conducted by our Kalikow School Poll Program Director, Dr. Craig Burnett, that we'll have a chance to discuss the findings with our Kalikow Senior Presidential Fellows, Ari Fleischer and Phil Schiliro. The Senior Presidential Fellows Program in the Kalikow Center was established in 2009 as a way to bring in practitioners in presidency studies and policymaking to complement the learning we get in the classroom and to bridge the work we do between academia and public life. And that has really been the mission of one of the fundamental founding goals of the Kalikow Center, of the Kalikow School, and of the Public Policy and Public Service Program, PPPS, for those of you in the know, to bridge the study of politics with the practice. We have many topics to discuss, from presidential approval to policy issues to Ukraine, the state of American democracy, to name just a few, and a lot to cover today. So let me be brief in my welcome and introductions. I want to give a special thanks to the many units within the university that have supported this event and the Kalikow programming. It is a delight, President Poser, to have you join us today. The Hofstra College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Dean, Dan Siebold, thank you for joining us. Provost Janet Lenahan, delighted to have all of you here with us today. Thank you. Special thanks to the Hofstra Office of University Relations, the Hofstra Cultural Center. Athleen Collins started, just a little personal note here, in her first year, she celebrated her birthday during the conference on the Eisenhower presidency, and today she is celebrating her birthday discussing the Kalikow School Poll. So please just join me in wishing her a very happy birthday. We're delighted to have 4 classes with us today. We have PPPS 1, Dr. Fritz's class, Introduction to Public Policy and Public Service. Dr. Labresco's class, Introduction to Civic Engagement. Dr. Parati's class on Public Opinion and Political Communication. I understand you've all been researching the poll closely in the past 12 hours. And Dr. Feldman's American Political Thought class. And of course, we have many other students, faculty, guests joining us. It's wonderful to have everyone here. And let me also just say thanks to Newsday published a very instructive article on the Kalikow School Poll this morning, and you'll be able to find that online. What we're going to do today is I'm going to provide brief introductions of our Kalikow Fellows. Then I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Burnett to summarize some of the key findings from the poll. We're going to move the screen up then and move on stage for discussion, and that's why Dr. Burnett kindly prepared color copies of his slides for you, so you don't have to take extensive notes. You can refer to them for discussion in the question and answer, and we will try to leave at least half an hour. The Q&A session will be, as is now practice in this room, we will ask people to line up at the microphone. We need to do that for the live stream. And we're going to ask students to take priority with the questions. So please plan for that. Our Kalikow Fellows, I think, in many ways need almost no introduction because their contributions to public service are so deep and so well known. But let me just provide a brief biography, and I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Mr. Ari Fleischer was White House press secretary for President George W. Bush, delivered the daily White House briefings from 2001 to 2003. In the time that he worked for President Bush, 43, he served as spokesperson during the presidential recount, in 2000, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, 2 wars, and the anthrax attack. His best-selling book, Taking Heat, I think Dr. Himmelfarb has a copy, details his years in the White House and reached number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list. And I understand he has a new book coming out this summer. I'll let you say the title, Ari, when we're on stage. Prior to joining the Bush campaign, Ari Fleischer was the national spokesperson and communications director for Elizabeth Dole's presidential campaign. He previously worked extensively on Capitol Hill as a press secretary in both the House and the Senate. It's a pleasure to welcome you back today, Ari. Phil Schiliro is a Hofstra alum, class of 78, political science. He would be a Kalikow School grad if it were today. Has more than 30 years of experience in Capitol Hill and the executive branch. He served as Director of Legislative Affairs in the Obama White House from 2009 to 2010, Special Advisor to the President in 2011, and the President's advisor for the Affordable Care Act and healthcare policy in 2013 and 2014. As President Obama's liaison to Congress, Mr. Schiliro played a key role in the passage of the Affordable Care Act and other historic laws and reforms in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and then returned to the Obama administration to assist with the implementation of the ACA. Before joining the Obama White House, Mr. Schiliro worked in Congress for over 26 years, working for U.S. House Representative Henry Waxman as Chief of Staff, Democratic Staff Director of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Policy Director for Senate Minority Leader Tom Daschle, and Staff Director for the Senate Democratic Leadership Committee. He currently has co-founded 2 nonprofits, Co-Equal and Grow New Mexico. It's a great a pleasure to welcome a Hofstra alum back to campus today. Thank you, Phil. And before I turn the floor over to Dr. Burnett, let me just also say Peter Kalikow, Hofstra alum, class of 65, could not join us today. I think he might be watching the live stream. But he, of course, has founded the Kalikow Center and the Kalikow School and the Kalikow School Poll, which is an outgrowth of the foundational work that the National Center for Suburban Studies did with polling from 2008 to 2018. And so we're delighted to have the support of Peter Kalikow. The Kalikow School Poll, this poll is the 6th, really the kind of the capstone of our polling on the 2020 presidential race. The Kalikow School Poll started in November 2019, an early assessment of what was happening with elections. We did a second one in 2020, in spring of 2020, 2 in the fall of 2020, and 1 in April of 2021 in conjunction with the 100th days of the Biden administration. So it is especially exciting, I think, to look at the early Biden presidency and assess what the prospects are for leadership and policymaking looking forward in 2022 and maybe even early look ahead to 2024. So please join me in welcoming our guests, and I will turn the floor over to Dr. Burnett. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. I just want to reiterate my thanks as well, especially to Peter Kalikow, who I give a lot of credit to funding this this project and really giving us the space to ask questions that are unique. And that's really what I identify as sort of what makes the Hofstra Kalikow School Poll special, is that we get to ask questions that no one else gets to ask. And on this poll, you'll find some that are asked in lots of places, and then lots you'll never probably see again. And the reason I like to do that is because it gives us an opportunity to really dive into the minds of the voters and to get a sense of what they're thinking and how they actually think about the things that matter underneath what is often a surface level question. And we get to mix it up here a little bit. We do both the topical things and we get to do the academic things too. So I really have enjoyed it, and I did want to reiterate my appreciation for this. But one must always keep in mind you are the opening act and you have a timeline to keep. So we will dive right in because nobody came here for the opener. We all came to watch the act that we paid for. So in this first slide here, I've got a couple of, this is more of the kinds of things you're going to see in all over the country in different polling outfits. And we have first here at the top is satisfaction with the country. And sort of is a nice to keep this, because we have a similar polling pattern over time, there is a slight difference in this poll in April really as well of last year, and that we have a little bit of a switch between registered versus likely voters, and that's probably useful to keep in mind as we go through this for those of you who understand what that means. But in most cases, I think the numbers are more or less accurate and reflective of what's going on in the country. They just sort of seem to match. But you can kind of see what's happening. You're walking up to really the election in 2020, and you can kind of see that Trump's numbers as sitting president really start to decline, right? And we go back all the way even to the precipice of the COVID-19 pandemic, and things were doing pretty well, right? People are actually fairly optimistic, and those we see take a dive. Biden did reverse that for a very short period in April, but as we see in this poll, it's dropped about 10 points. And this is indicative of sort of where the take-home point is from this survey, is that things are not going particularly well for Biden in this survey. But I do have an interesting question of which I'm excited to see what everybody thinks of. The second here on the bottom is presidential job approval. And again, you can see the same sort of pattern emerging. Trump doing fairly well as we approach the election. We do see a decline. That's not so surprising, right? Things really did take a turn on the president there. But Biden comes into office, and we sort of think there might be a little bit of a honeymoon. And on that survey, we actually asked people if they thought they were paying more or less attention to politics. We kind of wanted to see what the mood of the country was. And people had sort of reported they were feeling fairly happy about the fact that they were paying less attention to politics. So there was sort of a little bit of a high there, and that has subsequently come back down in this poll as well, about 10 points. This is, is also related to some of the slides. So as you're following along, you have the handouts. I know I'm moving quickly here. That's one of the reasons we have it. But this is a net approval rating on various issues that we've been polling about for both Trump and Biden over the years now. And the picture tells probably one of the clearest stories about what is going on in this poll, which is the black bars represent what we measured in April of 2021. The gray bars represent what we measured this year. And anytime it goes below the 0.0 mark, that means there's a net negative rating on that policy area. Anytime it's above, it's a net positive. This is actually not that surprising if you look at the April numbers. Trump was kind of around here too, right? It wasn't that different. The policies in particular were just sort of, so-so. He had a decent rating on the economy for a while, a couple other issues that he was doing pretty well. But you look at what Biden walked into, it looked kind of in that same setup. A year later, a drastic change. In every policy area that we measure, significant declines from the previous year. I want to highlight in particular the economy here, because we're looking at almost a 30-point swing in just 1 year's time. This is really scary if you're one of the individuals who is thinking about running for Congress on the Democratic side, and possibly even scary if you're thinking about running in 2024. What is going to be the shape of things? Well, here's the curiosity I wanted to point out. The fact is, when we asked people how they thought they would vote if the election were today in 2024, no, it's not too early, unfortunately. Everyone's going to be talking about this pretty soon. But it's a toss-up. Let's put that aside, though. We are, in fact, 2 years away. There's no guarantee these are going to be the candidates. But it is, I think, reflective of sort of where are the people at right now? And the answer is they don't know. They're 50-50. But here's the one I probably was most interested. The generic congressional ballot question that we asked, which is if the election were held today and you had a nameless Democratic candidate versus a nameless Republican candidate, basically a party preference question, how would they do? The answer is even. It's even money. And I've asked actually Ari to sort of think about this in his recollections of the cycles that he's experienced to see how this compares at this point in time. But my personal thinking was that this would be lower. And that gets us into the issue that really matters, the economy. And as you can see, all of these bar charts, they represent individual questions. So we have a battery of 5 questions getting at different things here. They tell a similar story. And that, some people are doing pretty well, right? And in fact, actually, the group that reports doing the best is the Republican Party, those who are members of the Republican Party or self-reported members. But there's a lot of potential problems out there. In particular, people really have grabbed onto the idea, they feel it, that inflation has increased in the last year, well into the 80s and 90s across subgroups. In addition, everybody thinks that this is a very important change. Everybody's watching, they feel it, they're primed to do something about it potentially. And this mixes in with the next question here, which is that people don't report that they believe wages have increased in the last year, and they have. But this is what the takeaway, I think, is that people don't think it's been enough. It hasn't kept pace. And so this creates a very sort of toxic setup potentially for people as they enter into the election cycle in earnest. The mood for next year is also dour. And you can see there's a partisan split there as well. Democrats are a little bit more positive than Republicans. Now onto some policies that I don't think I've seen asked in this way, but certainly people have danced around. What's the support for certain kinds of activities? Going to school or college? It's the same more or less across every issue. This is a very partisan issue for most people. Republicans don't support it, Democrats do, independents are somewhere in between and a little bit situational sometimes. But as you can see, there has been a change in opinion since we asked about this in April of 2021. And so this is where I think we might be approaching an equilibrium here, and that we're going to find that there's going to be partisan splits, and they might get worse. Now, the question is, how does this play out? That's a good question to ask. My supposition is that potentially more democratic urban areas might adopt mask mandates going forward, but I think in most of the country, we've probably seen our last. What should happen if the CDC does come out and say, let's bring back some mask mandates? Again, partisan splits emerge. Democrats very much in favor of it. Independents less so. Republicans opposing a great deal. Most Republicans, 70.7%, think it should be individual level decision. Democrats are much more likely to have the local authority step in and introduce mask mandates. On the others, there were fewer responses. It really does seem to break down. Most people think it should either come back or it should be up to the individual going forward. The topic of the day is probably Ukraine. This is where I get to have, so there was a poll last cycle that asked whether or not you'd support the giant meteor versus any other candidate. A lot of people said they'd be happy with a giant meteor hitting the earth. This is as close as I get to those kinds of questions. I asked people if they knew what the T stood for in NATO. Okay, good news, actually, most people do, right? So it's actually 78%, which you go, wait, what happened to the rest of the people? I'm here to tell you this marks about as well as we can identify our vice presidents. Not bad, right? Okay, let's give America a break here, everybody. It's okay. So when we get to the next question here, willingness to send troops, there's not really much of an appetite for this. There's not a huge partisan split. You see a little bit more Democrats. That's your rally around the president kind of effect there, but it's more or less negligible. There's only 23% or so who have an appetite for it. So I don't think the public's behind it. Of course, this is a volatile situation. It could change. Support for sanctions, however, we asked this in two ways. The first question we asked, just a general support for sanctions. The second question, and this was a split sample, so you only got one of them, so it didn't cross-contaminate. But the second sample got that question the exact same, but it highlighted the fact that supporting sanctions would very likely lead to an increase in your pain at the pump, your energy prices in general. Support for these policies is strong. Now, as I point out to you, I do produce some pretty good shifts here in my little experiment. 10 points. I'm thrilled with that because I could probably publish that result, but substantively, I think we should take away the point that it's still strong support. Even when I point out that it's going to cost you money probably, we still get 72, 73, 70, 68% of people, even 68% of Republicans. It's strongly supported is the conclusion I would take. We get into a couple of questions on sort of the state of the democracy in this country. There's one more that I'm not going to present in there, that's about secession that we've been asking for a few cycles now. This is how we feel about the January 6th assault on the Capitol. It's certainly been in the news a bunch. We've asked it now twice. Last year, more or less right after the event, a couple months, and then a year's reflection over time. And you can see there are some shifts going on here. In fact, people are, as you look across these subgroups, you have the Democrats grouped together, Independents grouped together, and Republicans grouped together, and they are shifting a little bit. And what's happening is largely, just the broad take-home point is Democrats are more or less the same, but as you see, it's really happening with Independents and Republicans, and what's happening is they're shifting more to the categories of this was some kind of out-of-hand protest, or in some cases, it looked like a normal rally to them. And then the one that I think is sort of an interesting question And I don't know exactly what to make of it at its core, because I don't know how much people actually believe this sort of thing. Is it the case that 60.4% of Republicans still believe that Trump won the presidency in 2020? I don't know. I suspect not. I suspect it's just something you're sort of expected to say. It's sort of become kind of this essential quality to be a member of a group. You have to say these kinds of things. That certainly exists in public opinion, but I haven't been able to dive deeper into this yet. I just wanted to see if there was any appreciable shift over time, as we've had a year to sort of digest more information, confirmatory evidence has come out, trials have happened, that sort of thing. Not a lot has really happened in this sort of time, and that more or less we see a status quo from we do a year ago. And with that, I'll turn it over to the rest of the panel. Thank you. Probably escape out of here.
Thank you, Dr. Burnett. Thank you. Again, Dr. Burnett, thank you for that very quick and substantively rich summary of the Kalikow School Poll. I strongly recommend that you look at the full executive summary, which is available on the Hofstra website. It was released this morning, and we certainly have several highlights in the attached handout. We had set a few questions for discussion, and I'd like to begin to ask our fellows for a general reaction, the question of promise or peril, based on the Kalikow School Poll results. And in particular, I just want to put into context two figures. The satisfaction with the direction of the country, what the Kalikow School Poll found, 21.7%, is fairly low. The Real Clear Politics average is at about 27%. I believe NBC recently ran a poll last week that was about 22%. So this is, obviously there's some fluctuation. We've been below that before in American politics. In January 18th, 2021, the average was just under 21%. In October 2013, during the government shutdown, it was 18%. October 2011, it was just on 17.7%. These were averages that I found. In the summer of 2020, it was about 23.6%. So we've seen these low numbers before. But what is that? Can we put that in context? The satisfaction with the direction of the country and President Biden's approval rating. And so the Kalikow School Poll finding of close to 43% is roughly in line, a couple percentage points of other national polls that have been taken. Some have been at about 40. Craig pointed out that this is lower than any of the Kalikow School polls found for Donald Trump during his presidency. Of course, the Kalikow School polls were taken at specific points. If we look at the full scope of the Trump presidency, Gallup at least had a low of 34% in January 21. I believe his average approval rating was a record low of 41% compared to, which actually was not the lowest in the modern presidency. Truman was 32, Carter was 34. It was George W. Bush was 34%. Actually, Trump's average, his final rate, final ratings were well below 50%. So where does this put the Biden presidency, with some of that for kind of context?
Well, first, having worked on many campaigns, I love polls. Polls are great intelligence reports into what's going on, but they alone don't tell you the story. Election cycles tell you a lot of the story first. History tells you a lot first. So the first thing I look to when I say what's going to happen in October or November 2022 is what historically happens in first-term presidential elections. And the party in power almost always loses seats. It's a check and a balance. You elected the guy, and now you say, whoa, I probably don't like you. and I'm going to now vote in Congress for the opposite party. It happens to both parties. The only modern-day exception took place in 2002 when George W. Bush, having won in 2000, actually gained seats in both the House and the Senate in his first midterm election, but that was a 9/11 effect. So the historical context is the Democrats are in trouble coming into 2022 just by virtue of having won in 2020. Add to it now these low poll numbers, and they're very low poll numbers. These are not middle low poll numbers. These are very low poll numbers for President Biden and the Democratic Party. It's tremendous headwinds against the Democratic congressional candidates. There's a mood for change. There's a mood to throw the bums out, and that's really harmful when it's happening to your side. The same thing I point out happened to Donald Trump's team, my team, in 2018. Trump won in 2016. In 2018, first midterm election that he was up for, he had low poll numbers, low job approval, low satisfaction or direction of the country numbers, and the Republicans got their clocks cleaned, and Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats took over the House. So this is now the mirror image of that election, and if I had to guess now, Joe Biden and the Democrats have about another 2 to 3 months to find something. I don't know what it is, but to find something that can reverse their numbers. Once you get to about June of the election year, the trends start to lock in, absent a real big external intervening event in the summer or the fall. And that's the problem the Democrats have. They really are running out of time, and nothing's going right for them. Right now, we're looking at a blowout election where the Republicans are going to take back the House, probably take back the Senate, and Washington will return to divided government, which is what the voters seem to want to have as a signal to President Biden. Uh-oh.
I'll build. I always look to find agreement with Ari where we can. And so I'll build off the first point he made. If we go back 100 years, there have only been 3 elections in the midterm where the party in power in the White House didn't have a bad election. And the first one was 1934, and that was in the midst of the Depression when the Roosevelt administration picked up seats. The second one was 1998, and that was with Bill Clinton. And that was following an impeachment attempt, which was unpopular in the country. Democrats didn't gain seats, I believe, in the House, were even, but picked up seats in the Senate. And then, as Ari said, post 9/11 in 2002. So those are 3 elections in a 100-year period, and Ari used the right word, headwinds. Now, there's a movie, and I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know the name of the movie. I just know a line from the movie, which is, well, you're saying we got a chance. And so I'd say, what is it? So it's a movie I never saw.
Thank you, Dr. Feldman.
But
Were you just addressing Phil and me?
But one of the things that happens when you work in government and politics for a long time is there is a lot of volatility. And so something could happen that changes the directory. I like to believe something will happen. I think when people put on the news at night, it's very rare there's any good news. So we've gone from, we're almost 1 million deaths from COVID now, and people are tired of the restrictions. There's inflation on the news every night. There's the existential worry about Ukraine. It's not a surprise to me that people have angst. It is a surprise to me with that angst, and Craig pointed this out, it's still even on the generic ballot. I would have guessed that would be about an 8-point difference right now, and it's even. That doesn't make any sense to me. One of the things, and you referred to this briefly, if we're just looking at economics, unemployment is below 4%. Over the last year and 3 months since President Biden took office, by the end of this week, 8 million jobs will have been created. Wage growth is up over 5%. We've had the fastest economic growth probably in history, and productivity is up 2%. And over a year, the deficit is being reduced by about $1 trillion. We've gone from 2 million Americans being vaccinated to well over 100 million people being vaccinated. I would guess that what I just said is never on the news at night, and it's not headlines in the paper the next day. But every time gas prices go up, and Ari was gone at the time, but this happened in the Bush administration in 2008, when gas prices were actually higher in real dollars than they are today. It always happens, no matter who the administration is. Reporters go out to gas stations and they're standing in front of the prices being changed and saying, this is record gas prices. I'm old enough to remember when this started in the early 1970s, when gas went from about 27 cents a gallon to about 70 cents a gallon. And it's been a cycle ever since. It happens every 2 or 3 years. Prices go up, they eventually come down, they go up, they come down. And I can tell you, having been through these cycles, whenever they go up, poll numbers go down. Question is, are prices going to go down sometime in the next 4 or 5 months? Because I agree with what Ari said. At some point, things get baked in. It's very hard to change it. So there are big headwinds, obviously significant problems, and external problems that can't be controlled like COVID. Notwithstanding all that, the answer to your question is I see promise. I'll elaborate later.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Burnett in a minute to ask the follow-up, the next question. But I just want to say, as I was listening to both of you, I was thinking I should have reframed the title, Peril or Promise, because we started out, both of you have discussed the challenge of headwinds, the peril, and then it sounds like there is some discussion of prospects for promise. Whether that's in November or more longer term, I guess, remains to be seen. But with that, let me turn it over to my colleague, Craig, if you'd like to ask the next question.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to ask you guys to dig in a bit on this sort of what I notice the same sort of things, in that you would expect that, given how bad things seem to be, why are the numbers not more in Republicans' favor? It is sort of a question. But the thing, and this is where I'd like to sort of have you guys jump into, is one of the things that I've picked up on just by digging in the numbers, and those aren't really reflected in these in the same way, is that I've kind of, after looking at how it was for Trump and when things got bad for Trump, especially in March, after March of 2020, his people stuck with him a bit more. And I've noticed a lot more Democrats are sort of willing to say things are bad. And I don't know if that is then when you ask them, yeah, but when push comes to shove, how are you going to vote? Do they come home? And maybe that's just how they reflect better in the public opinion surveys. I haven't really thought much about it, but you guys have been around politics a long time. What do you guys think is there still that Trump sort of, they stick with him no matter what, and that Biden's never going to have that kind of benefit, or what do you think is going to happen as we gear up for what's actually going to happen, I guess, in 2022?
Could you rephrase? Is the ultimate question is what's going to happen in 2022?
Yeah. Ultimately, I would like to know, but I'd like to know: do you think is it true that the Democrats just are willing to jump ship more? Is there truly this Trump effect or is it just sort of a Republican effect that they stick with their teammate longer?
So the short answer is I don't know, but I think I could explain some of the numbers you have. For instance, you had a poll number there, if you all have the slides. Look at the number on climate change. I think what happens on climate change is Republicans are saying he's doing too much, Democrats saying he's doing too little, and so you get bad numbers on climate change. And I think that President Biden is in that place right now where he gets buffeted both places. The Democratic base is disappointed. They wanted more to happen. The Republican base believes too much has happened. There's a core part of the Republican Party that's completely aligned with President Trump, and they're just not going to be open to anything. The number I'm curious about, and I'm wondering whether they shifted party registration as the independents in the way the poll is constructed. But I see that, and I think that accounts for some of the numbers for President Biden. I do think a lot of those Democrats are going to come home as we get closer to the election, so those numbers change. If I were a Republican right now, the Republicans don't need me, I'd be talking about the 1946 election. The reason I talk about the 1946 election is that one should have been a good midterm election for Democrats. We had just won World War II. President Truman was the president. Unemployment was about 3%. Farm prices were good. The economy was generally doing okay. But on the other side, there was high inflation. There were labor strikes in the country. And we had shortages. So we had meat riots in the country. Butchers were going out of business. We had car shortages. People in that year focused much more on the negative than they did on the positive. They didn't focus on, in Washington, and Ari and I have both lived this. Almost every cycle, everybody wants to talk about jobs, jobs, jobs. Unemployment's too high, unemployment's too high. Okay, well, now unemployment is below 4%. You think that would be a positive. $1 trillion in deficit reduction, we think that would be a positive. In 1946, the negatives outweighed the positives. And when the election came, I think Democrats lost about 55 seats in the House, about a dozen seats in the Senate. And Republicans, for the first time in 16 years or so, got control of the House and Senate. Now, if I were a Republican, that's where I'd stop talking. So I'd end it right there. But I'm not a Republican. So in 1948, President Truman ran for re-election, and he won. And not only did he win, Democrats got back the House and Senate. So the volatility we see in politics is nothing, that part is nothing new. That's always existed. And I think what's also true is that for whatever reason, negatives beat positives. And you had one slide I found the most interesting. You referenced Republicans on it. When you ask people their personal situation, it's pretty good. Republicans were feeling almost 50% good about their personal situation. When you ask them what's going on generally, it's much more negative. And there's not, from a political standpoint, there's no easy fix to change how people think about that.
Let me start with the generic ballot, which is a very important measuring stick or predictor of the future election. And in the Hofstra poll, it shows it's an even Democrat-Republican on the generic ballot. I read a story this morning. There's a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts that released a poll this morning. I call it the Hofstra of Cambridge. Harvard University's poll has a 6-point Republican advantage in the generic ballot that came out this morning. So there can be noise and variations in these questions, but even at 0, history shows that if the generic ballot is at 0, Republicans win a lot of seats. And that's because that's a national figure. And when you get down to the battleground states, of which there are only 30 or 40 congressional seats that are really up for grabs by either party, a national generic level that's even means in those battleground states, Republicans have the advantage, just because of who lives in those states and where the competitive races are. So even at a 0, that's great news for Republicans. So no matter how you cut it, I can't wait to hear what Bill's promises that he sees on the horizon. That's the only thing that I can see that was going to really save the Democrats in 2022. Now, I will also say, my eyes are only on 2022. It is a fool's errand to cast your eyes ahead to 2024. Based on anything we know in 2022. And I'll go back to the Obama presidency. President Obama wins in a landslide in 2008 against John McCain. Clean John McCain's clock. Republicans are just deeply wounded. Republicans came back in 2010 and won 70 seats in the House. One of the biggest victories, swing of parties, in 100 years in the House of Representatives. 2 years later, President Obama wins re-election against Mitt Romney. 2 years later, Republicans clean the Democrats' clock and take, I think it was 9 seats in the Senate. So the only thing anybody who's reasonable, who wants to look ahead, should base on is 2022. 2023, 2024 will take care of themselves. But back to basics, it's going to be a really bad year for the Democrats. The only saving grace I see for them is Republicans already picked up 13 seats in the 2020 House elections. President Biden beat Trump, but Republicans, in the year that a Democrat took the presidency, won 13 seats in the House. That almost never happens. So I think the number of seats Republicans will win in 2022 will be a little bit muted by virtue of the fact that they got their down payment of 13 seats in 2020. And maybe that's a silver lining for the Democrats.
Could I add on to that
Please.
for a second? When I was talking about the Obama years, it is fascinating to me that it's the same regardless of whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. The pattern is the same. So Ronald Reagan won in 1980, and in 1982, Democrats picked up over 30 seats in the House. Ronald Reagan, I think, won 49 states in 1984, and in 1986, Democrats got the Senate. The last point Ari made was a really important one, and I don't mean this to denigrate polling. I followed the 2018 House races very, very closely. And going into Election Day, the best data Democrats had was that maybe if everything went right, Democrats would end up with about 223 seats, maybe 224. That would be it. Democrats ended up with about 234 seats in 2018. I followed the 2020 House elections very closely. And all the polls leading up to Election Day showed Democrats were going to win 10 to 15 seats. This was on the Democratic side, what people thought. And the night before the election, I talked to two of the people I trust the most who do this. And I said, what do you really think? And they both said, it's a minimum of a 10-seat gain. That's what we're looking at. And then as Ari pointed out, instead of a 10-seat gain, Democrats lost a bunch of seats. And I think Democrats have about 224 in the House right now. So polling only takes you so far. In some of these campaigns, execution really matters. Opponents really matter. Republicans had a great chance to get back the Senate in 2010, but they nominated candidates who are outside the mainstream.
And
so,
a witch.
An alleged witch,
Yeah.
right? So,
We had a candidate in Delaware. Her name was Christine O'Donnell. And if you guys are ever running for anything, do not use a sentence that uses the word not. She was quoted saying, I am not a witch. And that became basically her campaign slogan, and it wasn't a good one.
And there were other candidates that year who had unusual views on rape and reproductive abilities to block getting pregnant, and those were winnable seats for Republicans. And Democrats executed well, and they had the right candidates to run against. So it's too far ahead. I mean, again, I'm reflecting on my 2020 experience. The night before, it was 10 to 15 seat gain. We had the reverse in terms of a loss. Here, we're just in March, and things can change.
Well, there's so many follow-ups I'd like to ask, but I'll try to shift from elections to governance for my question, and then I think we'll have time for one more question from Dr. Burnett before we open it up to the audience. Each of you had different areas of expertise in the White House. Public communication, strategy for Ari, Phil, behind the scenes, legislative leadership. Based on your extensive White House expertise, where do you see opportunity for the Biden administration to have a chance, right? To make progress. I think, Ari, you said at the beginning, there are about 2 or 3 months, right, before the focus turns fully to the elections. Is there a possibility for major legislative productivity and in possibly bipartisan?
No, I mean, just the mood in Washington is to not get together and do things. So any salvation Joe Biden will have politically or substantively won't come from an act of Congress. The Democrat margins are too small, 50-50 Senate, about a 4-vote margin in the House of Representatives. I think the fatal error Joe Biden made was based on his history, based on how he acted as a senator, a more moderate Democratic senator. I think if he had recognized I have a 50-50 Senate, I have virtually no margin in the House, I'm not going to be able to win some of these real ideological issues that will move the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. I need to run as a centrist, govern as a centrist. I need to get Joe Manchin's vote and lose Bernie Sanders. Because if I get Manchin's vote, I'll probably pick up 10 or 15 Republican senators too. I think if Joe Biden had run like that and run right down the middle or governed like that, and said, I'm going to be the centrist president and a unifier I promised in my inaugural address. And if the progressives don't like it, tough. If the conservatives don't like it, tough. But I'm going to deliver for America down the middle. I think you could be looking at a very different type of Biden presidency. Too late for him to tack to that track now. The two things I think politically could help Joe Biden is one, if there's never another variant of COVID. So the things we're now starting to get used to, no masks, people, thank God, people aren't dying as much, hospitalizations are way, way down. If that continues from this point today all the way through the election, that's going to change all our psychology. That's the type of thing that can change whether the country's in the right or wrong direction. Now, of course, that's beyond Joe Biden's control, but that's one factor. The second factor is inflation. And I don't think, economically speaking, there's any chance this inflationary cycle we're in is going to break anytime soon. But if the inflationary cycle we're in broke, that could help him. If prices started to decline at the pump, if prices started to decline for food, if prices started to decline for how you heat your house, for how you pay for your air conditioning this summer, if you started to feel it in your pocketbook at the same time COVID was no longer an issue, that would change the mood. And those two things together, I think, would be what Joe Biden needs, or the Democrats need in 2022. But there's nothing in the control the Democrats can do to bring about either of those results. Either they will or won't happen.
Okay.
I actually think there is a decent prospect for bipartisan legislation in some areas. Remember, for a long time, there's always talk of infrastructure week, infrastructure week, infrastructure week. It actually happened last year, almost a $600 billion bill that's going to get better roads, better bridges, better water systems. It's going to have faster broadband around the country. That's going to start playing out in the next couple of years, but that got done. I think this week there may be a breakthrough on legislation dealing with insulin that could lower insulin costs for people all over the country. There's still a ways to go on that, but that's a bipartisan effort. Someone like Senator Susan Collins is doing great work on that. There's an under the radar. It was above radar for a little bit, and now it's under the radar. But it's one that Senator Collins, Senator Manchin are involved in, and there's a bipartisan group working on changing the Electoral Count Act, which was very important in 2020. It could be very important in 2024, and that's one that the administration is wisely staying out of and letting the senators try to find common ground on that. I think we'll probably get a bipartisan COVID package sometime in the next 6 weeks, which will provide more funding because that wasn't included in the last bill. I think that'll be important. I think there's a better than even chance a bill will get passed through reconciliation. Reconciliation is the one mechanism in the Senate where you don't need 60 votes, you just need 50. It's a mechanism President Reagan used to pass his tax cuts. President Bush used it to pass his tax cuts. President Trump used it to pass his tax cuts. That's a legislation that could deal with a lot of important issues that matter to Americans. And I think there's a better than even chance that happens. So I do think there's opportunities on that. And I think Ukraine matters a lot. I don't know if this shows up in the poll, but it certainly shows up in mental health surveys. Across the country, there's more anxiety. People are just worried more, and that's tracked through COVID. I think that probably shows up in polls a little bit. And I think Ukraine has, anytime you turn on the news at night and there's talk of the possible use of nuclear weapons, there's images of atrocities, that changes people's view. So I'm hopeful the atrocities in Ukraine won't last, that'll end, and I think that can have an impact here in our country.
Thank you. Dr. Burnett, did you want to follow up with, you had put that mini experiment in to discuss on Ukraine in the poll, or?
Yeah, I mean, we covered it in there, but
Sure.
I do think, just to sort of pick up where you're sort of leading off there, I think it's supported that there's a lot of anxiety out there. Anytime you see this kind of shift in assessments, when appreciably on a lot of these policy areas, there hasn't been that much movement, right? So I think there is anxiety, and I think it's been with us for some time. And, what I sort of wanted to dig back into, and I think this is a good point to just sort of jump off from, is to agree with you actually about the fact that polling is hard. And to reiterate, one should not use a generic congressional to make predictions about your political future. But The fact is, it is harder to do. But the thing that and I'll only point that the Gallup doesn't do the horse race polling anymore, and they haven't done since 2012. It's very hard. But the thing that I think is not very well picked up on yet, and the thing that I think is my mind is changing to, and I'd love to hear what you guys think of this, is it's not just about how difficult it is to poll anymore. And that there are some pretty serious tectonic shifts going on in the electorate that is further complicating what it means to collect proper public opinion surveys. When I think, and I'll just highlight, there's been a lot of talk in the media and really by pundits, analysts, everybody has talked about the non-college educated working class whites are moving, and they've moved to Trump, and they might be just gone from the Democratic Party. And that would constitute a realignment, a total reshaping of the landscape. And I wonder, to the extent, what do you think that is true? Have the Democrats, something from their core since the 1890s, has that left them? Are they now more of the core of the Republican Party? And then, as is often the case with these sort of major realignments and tectonic shifts, the unreported movement that we're not catching, people of other stripes who are leaving the Republican Party, that maybe we haven't been able to catch because they've been going to independent status or something of the kind. To what extent do you think that is happening across the country? Do you think we're seeing big shifts, or do you think that we'll see, say, white working class voters mostly go back to the Democrats in the future?
And let me just say before you both answer, we'll move to questions after this. I imagine a lot of Dr. Parati students will want to follow up on that. So you may start, if students would like to start lining up, you can, and we'll get to the questions in a moment. Please, Ari and Phil.
Yeah, there's no question that in recent years, and I would hesitate to call anything a realignment until it happens over almost a decade, but no question in the last 4 years, 4 to 6 years, college-educated voters are increasingly becoming Democrats. College-educated voters were overwhelmingly Republican when Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush were president. The shift started in the early 2000s, and it's moved ever since then, and it was really pronounced in the Obama years, particularly in the suburbs. College-educated suburban women used to be a strong Republican voting bloc. They overwhelmingly shifted under Donald Trump to the Democrats. That got reversed in the 2021 election in Virginia, which is why that was so important to keep an eye on. But more importantly, it got reversed in Nassau County and in Suffolk County in 2021, and in New Jersey. I mean, there is a reason that race in New Jersey was as close as it was, and that's because the suburbs came back to Republicans. And that is a fascinating issue to me, because without Donald Trump on the ballot, if Republicans can come back in the suburbs and come back with college-educated voters, hugely significant if Republicans can at the same time keep the rural, non-college educated voter that you referred to. And that's the other shift. So until 2021 at least, the suburban college-educated voters shifted out of the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But then there was the other side of it. Voters without a college degree, and particularly lower income voters, increasingly are becoming Republican. The two parties, to some degree, have been swapping their bases. Now, if I'm a Democrat, what scares me to death is that the movement away from me among the blue-collar, non-college educated voter continues toward the GOP, but Republicans start to hold their own in the suburbs again. That's a kiss of death for the Democrats throughout the country. That means they're just left with urban areas. And so that has been the trend. But again, I always hesitate to draw lines and call it a realignment because it's volatile and trends can get reversed, and it depends on who the candidates are. Good candidates can make things happen. And I think the reason Republicans lost the suburbs and lost the college-educated voters at a really high rate was because of Donald Trump. He scared a lot of people. And without Trump on the ballot, what happens? So keep your eye on this one, though. It's the big political question about who's a Republican, who's a Democrat, and are long-standing definitions changing?
I agree that it's hard to say it's a realignment right now. It's too early, and I think that one is particularly fluid. I think the big question for Democrats, it's a longer period of time than this, is I'll go back as recently as 15, 16 years ago. Democrats had 2 senators in South Dakota. They had 2 senators in North Dakota. They had 2 senators in Arkansas. They had 2 senators in Louisiana. They had a senator in Nebraska. They had a senator in Indiana. They had a senator in Alaska. when people talk a lot of time about the filibuster and changing the rules, a lot of that comes to the fact that places where Democrats used to have senators, a lot of those places are not even competitive right now. And that, in those rural communities, it really is trying to figure out how to reconnect there, because a lot of those places, it's not a lot of votes, right? But it's a Senate seat. And to get legislation done, you need to have enough folks in the Senate. So someone like John Tester has managed to do it in Montana. There used to be 2 Democratic senators in Montana. Right now, there's just 1. And there were, someone like Heidi Heitkamp, who was popular in North Dakota. She wasn't able to win her race. So that's the one, to me, as I'm looking at the next 6 to 10 years from a legislative standpoint, can Democrats make some gains there?
Okay, thank you. I will refrain from asking my next follow-up, and I will turn it to the students. Please, go ahead.
Hi. So I was looking at the chart numbers for race relations and the net approval ratings, and saw that it dropped down a lot from April 2021 to March 2022. So April 2021 was before the summer of like a lot of protests, before George Floyd and stuff. So I was wondering.
That was 2020, right?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay.
But basically, yeah, you're right, sorry. I was just wondering, what happened like significantly that you think changed the approval ratings for Biden race-wise? Do you think the Kyle Rittenhouse trial had anything to do with it? Or the rise in like Asian hate crimes?
It's a complicated question, and I think it goes to the fact, there's a broader answer to your question, which is you always think of a Republican Party and a Democratic Party. Those are broad labels, but within the Democratic Party, there's at least 2 different parties. Within the Republican Party, I believe there's at least 2 different parties. And on the poll numbers, again, there's among some parts of the Democratic base, unhappiness that war's not happening. There was a whole movement to defund the police. That was never President Biden's position. It was never the mainstream Democratic position, not mainstream, but the majority Democratic position. But there were some people who felt very strongly about that. And so I think there'd be dissatisfaction. On the other hand, because defund the police was such a prominent issue, folks who aren't Democrats think that's what Democrats want to do. And that all ends up feeding into, I think, the race relationships and the numbers there. That would just be my instinct.
I want to go a little bit beyond that question and answer something you didn't ask. I'm going to make a prediction to you that the day after this election, the November 2022 election, if I'm right, Democrats lose the House, lose the Senate, the mood of the Democratic Party is just terrible. How did this happen? Why are we in so much trouble? Nobody likes us. That will be the day the pressure starts to mount on Joe Biden to declare he will not run for re-election. The day after the election, so in November. So this is almost April, 7 months from now. Pressure is going to start to mount on Joe Biden saying, don't run. Look what's happened to the party. You're older than most people's grandfathers in this room. Don't run for office again. We need a new generation of Democrats to save the party. And I think that's going to turn into a huge drumbeat where the Democrat Party a lot of people be chafing at the bit to be the next person. And the person who will go to Joe Biden and deliver the news that he needs to step down and be a one-term president will be the person who actually did the most to help him become president, and that'll be Jim Clyburn, elder statesman, Democrat from South Carolina, who helped Joe Biden win after losing Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada. Then he won South Carolina and ran the table. I think Clyburn will go to President Biden and say, you have to be a one-term president. You need to allow our candidates enough time to run because it's really hard to mount a campaign, and they will need time in an open seat. So that's my prediction to you about what will happen the day after the 2022 election.
Sorry.
we should move on, okay? But we'll come back, okay?
Okay.
All right, thank you. Dr. Burnett, we had, before we move to the second question, we had a randomized sample, questions 24 and 25, asking the respondents whether they supported or opposed reducing the responsibilities of local police departments by reallocating funds to other government agencies. Half the sample got that. The other half asked, do you support or oppose defunding the police? Do you have what the breakdown was, what the difference was?
Yeah, when I took a quick look at it, it was more or less
It was
continuous from the
stable,
last.
right?
Yeah, the term defund the police, it costs you about 10 points on the policy, just about. So anytime, so the takeaway being when Republicans insist on using defund the police, that helps them. And if Democrats conversely would get away from that, that would help them. So it cuts both ways. But whenever you talk about the policy as, hey, we think that police dollars could be used for X, Y, and Z, do you think that's a good idea? People go, yeah, that actually sounds pretty reasonable. When you say, so there's this idea out there to defund the police, that's when people say, wait a minute, hold on. Even though it's the exact same policy we're talking about. So it's pretty constant, about 10 points.
And that, we did that in 2021 and 2022, right? That was the,
We've done it for a couple of years.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think
Right.
that might even be
It
like
might-
4 times.
okay,
Yeah, it's very stable.
yep, okay, thank you.
Can I add an irrelevant point on that? It's my recollection, you tell me it's true. There was this phenomena, 2013, 14, 15. If you did polls and asked people if they supported Obamacare,
Right.
and at the same time you asked the same question, but you called the Affordable Care Act, the Affordable Care Act always polled better. So how you ask the question, what the words you use, really makes a difference.
Exactly, and we did so on purpose to highlight that as these things get talked about, because that's why the parallels are there. As the policy was pitched as Obamacare, it hurt them. But as you talked about, and you know this better than anybody, as you talked about the individual things that go into it, when they hear about it and they become familiar with it, and eventually they start to use it, right? They actually go, oh, actually this makes some sense, right? And so there is a sort of, look, they pay a lot of people money to do this kind of stuff, right? People like Ari that get out there and help shape the narrative on these things. And they're done for very purposeful reasons.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, Mr. Hi, Mr. Schiliro, Mr. Fleischer, Professor Burnett. Thanks for coming today. Welcome. Is there anything, do you think that will change anything in the midterm that would change the general trajectory of the midterm race of the 2022 elections? The polls, anything that would potentially change this, with the polarization in this country? Because the polls show, most people think Republicans will win both chambers, or at least the House. Is there anything politically that could change voters' views, in your opinion?
I was just going to repeat what Ari said before. I think if inflation comes down, I think that makes a difference. I think if we don't have another terrible COVID variant, that makes a difference. I think if there's a good outcome in Ukraine, that the atrocities could start and stop and there's some stability, I think that can make a difference.
Would that affect, that's, the United States is not in that. Would, people would be happy, I'm sure, but a lot of people don't like what Biden's doing in the Ukraine.
It affects, I think it has a general impact on people's views if they see a good outcome in Ukraine. And so it doesn't have to be specific to this country. I think that just the absence of some bad news there and a good outcome, I think can make a difference.
And I just reiterate what I think there's 2 factors I cited before, COVID and prices starting to drop on the things that everybody buys every day. Absent those 2, nothing will change political behavior significantly.
Would the January 6th Commission have anything to do with that? You
And then after
that
this,
would
we should
change-
move on after, okay?
Yeah. Would the January 6th Commission, you think, would change those views? Because I know those hearings, they're going to do primetime hearings soon, and they're going to make a big hoopla of the report when that comes out.
I think it's going to reinforce everything everybody already knows. It's going to make Democrats hate Donald Trump even more and say, see, we were right about everything all along. And most independents and Republicans are going to say, this is old news. Why are you bothering us with this? We're more concerned about the 2022 issues.
Greg, yeah, thank you. to be continued.
To add to that, we tried to move the needle pretty hard on the impeachment, and we weren't able to move it at all. I agree with that 100%.
Hi. So I have kind of a two-part question. I was hoping you would give me your thoughts on the first part first. How
You
worrisome?
can make a good future White House reporter.
Glad to know.
Very good setup.
How worrisome is it that around 30% of the country thinks that Trump won 2020?
I hate it because Joe Biden won 2020. And I'm proud to have said that on Fox News the day that Biden was declared the victor. And I said that I'm an American before I'm a Republican, and I offer congratulations to President-elect Biden. I think that type of acceptance of an election is essential to the noise of our democracy. It's the grease that makes the system work. And I think fairness is really important. But I also want to say to you that I understand people think that, and this poll had it even higher. But after the 2000 election, which was arguably, well, it wasn't arguably, it was a closer election, if I recall right, some 40% of Democrats thought Al Gore was the president. And Al Gore, when he would, former Vice President Gore at that time, would go around and give speeches, and he would kind of joke that he was the president of the United States. And the audiences would kind of laugh and chuckle about it. And in 2016, when Donald Trump won fair and square, how many Democrats said he's an illegitimate candidate, illegitimate president? Hillary Clinton accepted the results the next day, but then she went on 2 years later to call him an illegitimate president. Jimmy Carter, former Democratic president, called Donald Trump illegitimate and said the only reason he won was because of Vladimir Putin. So I'm a little sick and tired of people just looking at this issue and saying it's just those Republicans, it's just the Donald Trump people who didn't accept the results. The fact of the matter is both sides do it. Neither side should do it. We should accept the results and let our democracy speak for itself. But yeah, the Trump people are doing it now, and Donald Trump is doing it now. But it's not something that the Democrats haven't done. And certainly there were numerous objections to Donald Trump's election in 2016 on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate, where they tried not to count the ballots. They were collecting the people who would object to the ballots. Now, there was no riot, but there was the democratic process where they objected in 8 different states, including several of the impeachment managers against Donald Trump. They objected to the 2016 certification of the election. And don't even get me started on the attempt by Hollywood and other liberals to overthrow the results of the 2016 election in the Electoral College. It was a massive attempt to get electors to switch their vote and be faithless against Donald Trump in favor of Hillary Clinton to save the republic from Donald Trump after the voters already spoke. So I hate it all, except election results, and that's how you serve this country.
I have to say, because I try to agree with Ari on some things, I couldn't disagree with him more on this. There is no equivalency between the parties on this. So in 2000, Al Gore conceded the race. He didn't say there was a steal. He didn't say it was rigged. He didn't carry on in rallies for years after the election. He accepted the result. Hillary Clinton accepted the result. There was no armed insurrection on inauguration. There was no, let me put it this way. Al Gore and Hillary Clinton never called the Secretary of State and said, just get me 11,780 votes. Didn't call individual canvassers and tell them to switch how they were going to report their results. That never happened. One of the quotes that sticks in my mind the most around January 6th was one of the Trump supporters who were there that day, because to me this is a chilling distillation of the thought process. Was we weren't there to steal things. We weren't there to do damage. We were just there to overthrow the government. That's in a Wall Street Journal reporter's book who embedded with a group of core supporters of Donald Trump. That is very different. So I agree with some of what Ari said on accepting the results. Both parties have to accept when they win, they have to accept when they lose. But if the mind frame is, we weren't there to steal things, we weren't there to do damage, we were just there to overthrow the government, that is fundamentally different than anything before.
Yeah. That dovetails really nicely into my next question.
Okay, and now it's gonna have to be quick, okay, because we have more people behind you. Go ahead.
So what do you, as quickly as you can, what are the implications of the drop in perception of January 6th as an insurrection and the increase in perceiving it as a normal rally or an out-of-hand protest? Because the numbers changed over the last year.
We live in when Ari was in the White House press room, I don't think it was a 24/7 news cycle at that point. It might have been like a 12-hour
They woke me
news
up
cycle.
enough at night.
Right,
It
but
was.
but it was just different, right? The Washington Post wasn't updating its homepage on its website every 6 hours, right? So news has changed, the flow of news has changed, the flow of information has changed. And what that means is something that happened a month ago feels like it happened 6 months ago. January 6th, for a lot of people in Washington, is still very raw. It was very traumatic for a lot of people that day. But for most of the people in the country, it was something they saw on television and didn't affect them directly. So the intensity of the feeling of that changes through time. I think it'll be interesting when they actually hold the hearings, whether that changes. It's going to depend on the presentation and the information they've collected. But I think it's sort of natural, especially in the world we live in, that things just seem a long time ago. I do it my own way of trying to remember who won the World Series 2 years ago. And I never could remember. I can't remember who won the Super Bowl, who won the World Series. It's just too much that's happened in between.
It was the Oakland A's.
No wonder you forgot. To me, it was a riot. It was not an insurrection. And I think the same thing is true to the Department of Justice, because no one is being prosecuted for insurrection against the United States of America. People are being prosecuted for riot. They're being prosecuted for trespass. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who attacked a police officer, anybody who breached the walls of the Capitol deserves to have the book thrown at them. Anybody who stood out on the lawn and protested and yelled and shouted and said things was 100% within their constitutional rights. And you have the right to protest. You have the right to say whatever you want about any topic, and so long as you do it peacefully. So I draw that line. But again, I think these hearings are the classic example of our polarized times now, where again, it'll reinforce everything the Democrats have believed about the evil and why the Republic needs to be saved from Donald Trump, and most other people have moved on.
Okay, thank you.
Before you leave, I just want to read you one thing on this. I don't know if I'll be able to find it.
Can't sit down yet? No, you can sit down.
But this goes to the partisanship, and this is something that Mike Pence said about a month ago. I heard this week President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no more un-American idea than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. I look at that in relation to January 6th, and I agree with him. There was nothing more un-American than what happened on January 6th, and I do think it was an insurrection.
We have 3 questions, and we're going to try to get through all of them, okay? So let's go ahead, please.
Hey everyone, thank you for being here. It's always a pleasure to hear different perspectives. This question's for all the panelists. Wasn't touched upon in the presentation, but one thing I want y'all to talk about is secession. Now, the Kalikow poll has overall support for it at 28.5%. I just want you guys to talk about whether you think secession is possible, yes, no, and overall just broad implications from the idea of it.
I am 100% in favor of California receding from the Union. Seceding from the Union. And then the 49 of us will know what to do.
We have a lot of California students here, just so you know.
Goodbye.
Also,
Enjoy the
one
Pacific.
on the panel too, actually, just so you know.
And we,
True, I forgot about that, Craig. Please.
it's part of the wackiness. And we were talking about this earlier today, and I think a lot of people answer that question because it's a poll and they're going to have some fun and they're going to say it. I think the percentage of Americans who really want us to see is tremendously low because we're such a good country. So I pay it no attention.
I have no idea what it means either. I mean, if I'm living in Missouri and I want to secede, I don't know where I'm going. So I can't pick up the state and move it somewhere. So if it's Texas, in the past, that's been a thing in Texas a little bit. It just doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think it's a real thing.
I'm going to give Dr. Burnett the last word on this one because this was the question he developed in the fall of 2020. I have to tell you, I was a little skeptical. I said, who's going to talk about secession? And then when these numbers came in, we kept it. And this question has actually been cited in more recent research, questions, particularly after the 2020 elections, about the state of American politics. So I don't think it's an active possibility, but I think at this time, but I do think these numbers, when you have about a third of the country, or a third of the respondents, excuse me, in the March 22 poll saying this, I would say overall, the number is just under a third, and that's a source for concern. Craig, I'll give you the
Yeah,
last word on that.
I take this question as similar to what I was saying about, do 60% of the Republicans really think that Donald Trump won? I suspect not. And I suspect that if you ask people, and I think it's actually fairly clear over time, in the question itself, it sort of reveals that. And I actually take when I first thought about this question, the idea was, what are we walking into in 2020 was sort of what I was after. And the question was worded specifically, if your person loses, what do you think should happen? And so you can kind of see how that was fairly high. People were feeling very nervous about their candidate and whether or not they were going to lose. And you can see over time, the Democrats have settled back down, right? They really have. It's still, the baseline is still 20%, which 18, 19%, that's a concern, right? But, it's sort of settled a little bit, even if the overall numbers are sort of maybe impressively high. I don't think that people would know what to do with this if they really wanted to, right? Secession has sort of been closed out by the Civil War. I think we've answered that question. But, it's reflective, I think, of where people are at and how people think the stakes are higher. And I think in some level, when your party's in control, people feel better. And that's, I think it really is sort of about power here, and that's really what we're catching with this question. But I don't think we're gonna see armed insurrections at state capitals at this point to secede from the Union. I think we put that aside.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Vermont used to be an independent republic, so they can secede too, so long as they let us ski there.
Hello, I want to say thank you again to come and speak. I appreciate it, and I like listening to the discussion. So I just had a question about the perspective of party as we move forward, especially in terms of public opinion. As mentioned, there was a debate over whether or not Joe Biden can truly be considered a centrist. I know a lot of people around my age would definitely say so, and you could argue that at least with his policy between the Anti-Drug Abuse Act and then his switch to legalization of marijuana, there is kind of a centrist aspect to him. Do you think that there would be a benefit, at least politically, to a further embrace of what would be considered more dramatic liberal ideas from the left, kind of like how the right has sort of started to embrace the more radical Donald Trump ideas? Or do you think that would more further, develop the gap that is sort of formed within the centrist Democrats and Republicans versus the fringe?
If I followed the question correctly, I think if he tried to go dramatically to the left, he would lose a lot of support. He wouldn't have just in Congress, in the House and Senate, he wouldn't have the votes to move anything he wanted to move if he moved dramatically in that direction. And I think that results in a corresponding loss of support in the country.
Yeah. Do you think overall the party pushing toward a more left agenda would lead it to garner more support, especially amongst college-educated young people?
It's funny, in my whole time in government, I really didn't think of things in left and right. I thought of it as good policy. So what's the good policy that gets the result that people want? And I don't think of that necessarily as a left-right dichotomy.
Let me pick up on it. I think there are two different fights going on within both parties. Republicans are going through a split right now between the establishment and the populist wing, between the experienced people and you're all a bunch of bums, you know too much about things that are wrong, and we need a whole new group of people in there who reject everything that you've done before. And that's kind of the Trump populist split against the Bush insider establishment split groups writ large. I think the Democrats are in the middle of an ideological split still. They have a growing socialist wing inside the Democratic caucus in the House. They now have, I think, 6 elected socialists inside the Democratic caucus. You have the younger Democrats who think the most important issue is climate change and Green New Deal and the urgency of passing that to save the planet. And I think you really have an ideological split playing out inside the Democratic Party. And we're going to see that continue. So you have these two different splits, two different strains. I think Biden could have been the last centrist, and it's too late now. If I'm right and there's an open seat for the Democrats going into 2023 and 2024, you're going to really see this played out with an aggressive, younger generation of Bernie Sanders-style Democratic presidential candidates who are going to capture a lot of the passion and the energy, particularly of younger Democrats.
Okay, thank you.
The last question.
Thank you, that's a lot of pressure. Mr. Fleischer, I want to follow up on a point you made earlier about the elections from 2021, specifically in New Jersey and Suffolk and Nassau. So we saw major victories for Republicans, including Bruce Blakeman on county side, which you didn't even think would happen. And now, do you see, with Kathleen Rice retiring and that district opening up and other major races on New York State level, the governor's race opening up, do you see the Republicans taking that momentum into 2022, or you think it's going to burn out and it'll just remain a Democratic stronghold?
No, absolutely, the momentum maintains. That's the cycle we're in. That's the problem with President Biden's low numbers and the direction of the country. This is the headwinds, which have the potential to blow into a hurricane. In New York State, the Democrats just have such a dominating advantage. I don't see it playing out on the governor's race unless Cuomo defeats Hochul. I don't see Lee Zeldin being able to defeat Kathleen Hochul. I see if Cuomo somehow knocks Hochul off, if he decides to run, well then, yeah, I think Lee Zeldin is going to beat Cuomo, which would be amazing. Locally here, I probably don't know enough about the demography of each of the congressional districts and who the candidates are. But I'll tell you, in a blowout election cycle like this, if it's the blowout, if it's a 2010 style election or a 1994 style election, or flip it around, a 2018 Democrat wave election, a lot of safe people get swept out of office. The Senate race that I have my eyes on for the biggest surprise is Washington State. Washington State is represented by, what's her name?
Patty Murray.
Patty Murray, thank you. Patty Murray, who's kind of a not well known, hasn't really cemented herself. She's got middling numbers, but there's a veteran candidate running who is an incredibly articulate, powerful female candidate who is my surprise race of the 2022 cycle. And if it is a wave election and the Democrats wake up and say, what race will we never thought we'd lose, but we lost, it'll be Washington State. I can't say enough about the island. I guess it's just, I don't know how close the races are here because it's been so long since there was a good competitive race on Long Island.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can, since I'm the local politics guy, I guess I'll jump in. And I'm on the record saying this in the newspaper, so it's nothing too extravagant. But so the 2021 election, I think it's very important to keep in mind here, and especially on the island, that the analog is really 4 years before. And there was a lot going on in addition to Trump that really had an effect. In particular, there was a ballot measure that comes around once every 20 years in the state, and it really caused overperformance for the Democrats. And so, yes, I think 2021 was a good year for Republicans, but I think a lot of it is just sort of going back to a more normal. It is competitive here in Nassau County. I don't know why the narrative has somehow turned into this, the Democrats run the town. They don't. In fact, actually, they don't run any of the towns at present, and they usually don't run 2 out of the 3. So it sort of is a good place to be a Republican most of the time. They have the infrastructure, they have the supplies, they have the know-how, and they've been doing this for about 100 years, ever since Nassau County split away from Queens. So I don't really, I don't think that it's a good bellwether. I do think that it still is going to be a plus Republican year. That doesn't change anything, but I would not look at the Blakeman victory as particularly instructive, is I think the way I would put it. And I think that played out all across the island because there's not much to vote for in local elections. And so you do kind of pick up on very raw emotions when you have these off-cycle, only interested people show up, turnout was low, and it's entirely about turnout in those contests. I think Virginia is probably a more instructive case to look at, and possibly, really probably Virginia and New Jersey, because you bring out a more complicated electorate than you do in the local contests. And so it's there that I would so for the same reasons, I would point to it. I would not say Nassau County is particularly instructive in that sense.
There aren't a lot of issues I could say I have some knowledge of, personal knowledge. I grew up here. on Long Island, so I do know the county, and it's amusing to me to think of it as a Democratic
Yeah, it's-
stronghold.
it's a strange
Because when I
narrative that's
grew up, it
emerged.
was a Republican machine.
It still
And-
is.
and- Right,
It's a
but when
good one.
Carolyn McCarthy got elected, she was a predecessor to Kathleen Rice. She was only the second Democrat to get elected to that district in 100 years.
And I think
And-
Kathleen sort of is out of favor with the Democratic, and that's really probably driving the behavior more than she's afraid of winning reelection at this point.
Yes.
Well, we will. On that note, looking ahead to November, I think we've heard a very insightful discussion of promise and peril, and really actually a fairly, I think, cautiously optimistic look for the landscape of American politics over the long term. So we will be continuing this discussion. Please join me in thanking our speakers for a most instructive analysis, and to Dr. Burnett for the Kalikow School Poll. Thank you.
This is strange narrative.
This was really.
What do you mean? They never run anything.